Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much for having us here in Somerset. Would you say that you share more common ground politically and ideologically with Nigel Farage than you do with David Cameron?
No, I wouldn't. I do share a good deal of common ground with Nigel Farage, but not complete. UKIP has many policy areas that are essentially underformed, and therefore it's difficult to know precisely what their views would be. And on the European issue, I think we need a change in our relationship with the European Union, which may well mean we need to leave, but conceivably could be covered by a renegotiation. I think renegotiation is very difficult, but I don't think it's impossible.
You have claimed, I think, though, that Nigel Farage would make a better Deputy Prime Minister than our current one in Mr Nick Clegg.
I do. When the Conservatives went into coalition with the Lib Dems, I had very high hopes about it because I thought, and still think, that there is a very attractive liberal strain in that party of people who believe in freedom of the individual, who believe in a small state, believe in allowing people to make decisions for themselves about their lives. Unfortunately, as we've been in coalition, it's become clear that the stronger trend within the party is one of social democracy, which is much closer to Labour than it is to the Conservatives. Nick Clegg has been in a difficult position. I think he has done a national service by going into coalition. I think that was the right thing for the national interest, though not for his party's interest, and he deserves credit for that. But to keep his party together, it seems to me he has shifted to the left, towards social democracy. And actually his form of social democracy, I think, is bad for the country.
Do you think his party will suffer then in the upcoming European elections and perhaps next general election in 2015?
It's very hard to predict the next election. That historically the Lib Dems have gone down to about 10% in the polls in midterm and then bounced back to about 20% at general elections. Now, of course, they haven't previously been in government. And so it may be that they stick at these lower levels, in which case we would expect the Conservatives to win a lot of seats from them.
Would anyone make a better Prime Minister than Nick Clegg?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Deputy Prime Minister.
Deputy Prime Minister. Nobody would make a better Prime Minister than David Cameron. Make sure that's on the record. No, I can think of worse. I wouldn't be enormously in favour of the President of the Board of Trade becoming Deputy Prime Minister.
You've often filibustered in Parliament, and you're reciting poetry, examining the quality, I think, of Somerset eggs, discussing the Battle of Agincourt. You also attempted to amend the Daylight Saving Bill so that this county of Somerset could have its very own time zone. Is that not merely taxpayer-funded frivolity?
It was very dangerous making a joke in politics because a number of people thought I was serious about wanting to change Somerset time, and I had a few letters saying that this wasn't very wise. No, that we have our parliamentary democracy, and one of the means of preventing a bill going through is to talk it out. It's a perfectly legitimate means of stopping new laws. I happen to think the Daylight Savings Bill is based on wishful thinking. It's a thought that you can actually create more daylight in the winter, and you can't. Whatever happens, we are going to have very relatively few hours of daylight in the winter. And how you cut them up isn't going to make people's lives much better or much worse. We've tried it before. Portugal tried it as well, and people actually discovered that they hated getting up in the dark much more than they minded getting home in the dark. And therefore the change was pointless. And so I did what I could to kibosh it.
And you enjoy it?
Oh, it's great fun. There's no harm in enjoying politics. Politics is both enormously serious and enormously enjoyable at the same time. And I think politicians don't want to pull long faces the whole time and pretend it's all about sucking on lemons. There is an enjoyable aspect of politics, not just for politicians, but also for the electorate who, when they engage with it.
In one of your famous speeches, I think you entered parliamentary record books with that long word. Is it Floccinaucinihilipilification?
It is indeed, it is indeed. Which is a great word, and it's very interesting. I learned something from that. That it is very often how you say something rather than what you say that is important. Because I was making a very important point about the judges of the European Court who had ruled that their own pay had to be increased. Against the general principle that a judge should never judge in his own cause. Very interestingly, when they had a similar case before them last year, they ruled in exactly the opposite way. They said that the political decision had to stand and that they couldn't rule. And I think that's very important.
Yeah.
Using that word got a lot of publicity for what seemed to me a serious failing in the European judicial system. And rather gratifyingly, it's a failing that the judges themselves have put right. I can't claim that's cause and effect. I can't claim the European judges noticed what I'd said, but I'm pleased that they put it right. And it certainly did get quite a bit of publicity all around the world, word Floccinaucinihilipilification.
Yes, absolutely. That's the point that I was just going to make. Former Tory MP Gyles Brandreth, now we spoke to him and you mentioned you may have had a look at some of our interviews. I don't know if you've seen this, but I was just going to show you this. This is Gyles talking about you, yourself, and that moment in which you use the word. Now,
I haven't seen this one.
Now he's saying, well listen, he's saying that perhaps it's a shame that people remembered you, and indeed that speech, for that word rather than the point you were making. So he's taking a different point. Let's have a look.
What's depressing a little bit about Parliament is this, that what most people say in Parliament doesn't get noticed. You're talking about Jacob Rees-Mogg speech in which he says Floccinaucinihilipilification, which is fun, but actually really probably what he'd rather we knew is what he made a speech about farming or industrial reform or and the difficulty now with Parliament is that it isn't the fulcrum of debate in the way it once was, and what people say in Parliament doesn't count for as much as it used to. It's become the television studio, the radio studio, and I would like to see Parliament being more where things are announced and where people actually call the government to account, and what people say in Parliament matters.
So was that speech then, your speech, merely a triumph of form over substance?
Because the word was unusual, not deliberately so as it happens. I can't claim it was all beautifully pre-planned. Lots of people asked me to talk about it, from Andrew Neil to you onwards. And therefore on every occasion I was able to make the point about the European Court of Justice. And so absolutely, Giles is right that people focused on the word, but it gave me an opportunity again and again and again to make the point about the ECJ. And I had correspondence following from that about specifically the ECJ. So yes, of course, the thing people remember is the word, but that actually it allowed the issue underlying the word to be aired. And I don't think one should be too pessimistic about Parliament. I think Parliament does have an effect on the national debate, because things do get picked up, not necessarily immediately, but they get picked up at some point.
Do you enjoy being known as the honourable member for the early 20th century?
I can't think I'd say modern. I can't possibly be early 20th century. I'd much rather be the early 18th century or something like that. I never quite understood why anyone would think that the early 20th century is anything other than modern.
Do you hark back to the days of Downton Abbey then?
Downton Abbey is jolly good fun, but whether anybody really lived like that, I think, is open to debate.
Will you, or do you, send your children to private school?
I do, and I will, yes.
I think an education at a private school once provided the foundations for a fast track to success, but have university quotas and now perhaps posh prejudice, has that changed the playing fields at all? I'm
not worried about posh prejudice. I think there's no harm in pulling people's leg a bit. It's perfectly harmless fun. I'd very much hope my sons can go to Eton. Eton is an absolutely fabulous school. If they can get in is really the question, and so I am in favour of private education. I think people have the right to decide how to educate their children as they wish, and I see very little prejudice about it. So no, I'm not worried about it.
How important do you think a green environmental approach to politics is nowadays?
Depends what you're offering. I would like my constituents to have cheap energy rather more than I would like them to have windmills.
So, global warming, for example, is that for you a serious issue, man-made climate change, or perhaps you don't accept that?
If you read the IPCC report on this, it said that if we were to take action now to try and stop man-made global warming, it would have no effect for hundreds or possibly 1,000 years. I'm all in favour of long-term policy making, But I think trying to forecast the climate for 1,000 years and what little steps you make now, having an ability to change it, is unrealistic. And I think the cost of it is probably unaffordable. I think you need to look at ameliorating the consequences of anything that may happen, like dredging rivers on the Somerset levels so that the floodwaters have a means to escape, doing that on a wider scale, looking at the Dutch experience over hundreds of years in making land that is below sea level, prosperous agricultural land. I think you want to take that approach rather than trying to go back to living in the Stone Age by reducing people's use of energy.
What have future generations ever done for us anyway?
Well, no, it's very important to consider future generations, and Conservatives tend to. It tends to be one of the features of conservatism. But I think we have to be realistic about what we can change, the timescale over which we can change it. And actually, I think mankind is highly adaptable, and we need to look at more adaptability rather than changes in behaviour.
There have been a lot of sanctions imposed against Russia over the whole Ukraine issue. Are you concerned that Putin will hit back and that matters might escalate?
I think we should be very concerned. Russia has done something that Russia ought not to have been able to do, and we have been able to do nothing about it, of any serious kind. I don't think the sanctions amount to much at all. This is very dangerous for the world order, that the ability of powerful sovereign states to invade their neighbours without consequence has caused tension and problem and war over centuries, and it is not how things ought to happen. Having said that, we have to look at the limits of what we can do. And there we seem to be highly constrained. And the question is, are we going to go back to a Cold War situation?
What's the difference between the current Ukrainian crisis, if you like, and the Israeli occupancy of the West Bank?
Well, I think there are all sorts of issues that you could raise like that. I think you could certainly raise the Second Iraq War, that what was the legitimacy of that, not thoroughly approved by the United Nations and so on. I think the West has to be very careful in its criticisms of Russia, not to criticise it for doing things that we have done, but that's all the more reason for us ensuring that any actions we take are legitimate. And I'm afraid I think Tony Blair took illegitimate actions.
As a practising Catholic, is there any real sense, do you think, that now Britain is still a Christian country?
Yes, I think so. The Anglican Church is still the established church. That 70% of people describe themselves as believing in God. So that's still a pretty high number. But perhaps more importantly, all our institutions, our laws, are based on some form of belief. That's what they've emerged from. And I think it's very hard to dislocate a country from its history.
But in practice, do you think 21st century Britain, its people, their beliefs and their values are compatible with Christian teaching?
Oh, by and large, yes. I think the values are perhaps as Christian as they've ever been. I think we are, if you take the key precept, love thy neighbour as thyself, we're probably better at doing that than at any time in our history.
Is there anything wrong with having children before or without marrying? No. Children are a great blessing. As I know, I have 4 children. People's religious morality is a matter for them and their confessor. It's not a matter for the state. And I've got a couple of cheeky ones that we do to
okay, far away.
Most people. How much is a pint of milk?
A pint of milk is about 45p.
I've got written 45p. Outstanding. Loaf of bread?
It depends what type of bread you like, doesn't it? I mean, the loaf of bread question is a very interesting one, because when Margaret Thatcher first became Prime Minister, the loaf of bread was a price set by the government.
Oh.
Now it's not. And so you can buy fancy bread, you can buy disgusting black bread if you like.
Right.
It'll probably cost you a fortune, or you can buy an ordinary loaf of bread and you can probably get one for 75p.
Okay, I've got just over £1, but that's near enough. And first class stamp?
Oh, it depends whether you use a franking machine or not. I think it's about 60p.
62 pence? My goodness me. I've absolutely,
I'm quite surprised.
You have been labelled one of the most rebellious Conservative MPs and been dubbed, I think, David Cameron's worst nightmare. What is, from a backbencher's perspective, the most frustrating part of having David Cameron as your party's leader?
I'm completely supportive of David Cameron. I was very concerned. I didn't want to be his nightmare because I believe Prime Ministers should sleep well. They govern the country better if they're well rested, and they shouldn't have backbenchers intruding upon their dreams like sort of spectres haunting them. I think that David Cameron has been an excellent Prime Minister. I think he's got the big things right. Going into coalition was one of them, and that he has obeyed the constitutional norms of collective responsibility. And therefore he has led a government, not a faction or a party. And he deserves great credit for that. What are the frustrations? Well, we're in coalition, we're not a single party government. And the Prime Minister has to limit himself to being the Prime Minister of a coalition. It's difficult for him to be an aggressive party leader at the same time.
You would, I presume, do some things differently, though, if you were in his position.
Well, I'm not in his position, and I very much doubt...
speculating. Politics is about
I very much doubt Her Majesty is going to call me, so...
Are you a romantic?
Romantic in politics. Up to a point. I mean, I think I take a positive outlook on life and on politics. I don't entirely look through rose-tinted spectacles, but I think one should take a positive view about politics rather than be the voice of doom.
Are you a monarchist?
Oh, of course I am, yes. May the Queen live forever. And we have a wonderful picture of her behind me.
Penultimately, if you could choose 3 famous women to take to a desert island, who would they be? 3
famous women to take to a desert island. Where do you start? Well, I think it'd be very interesting to meet Mary, the Mother of God. That would be a great inspiration. And on a more secular note, Boadicea. See what was Boadicea really like.
Yes. And
then, who else? Probably Matilda, mother of Henry II, who would now become queen in her own right, obviously fought the wars with Stephen, but was a very key advisor to Henry II, I think a much underrated and capable historic figure.
And Mrs. Rees-Mogg wouldn't be too envious.
I don't think there'd be any envy with those 3 characters, no. I wasn't choosing for nefarious purposes. I was choosing for interest and discussion.
Absolutely. And finally, is Jacob Rees-Mogg too posh to become Prime Minister?
Well, I'm not going to, so it doesn't matter.
But, you know, if the opportunity arose...
But it's not going to.
No.
There's no point.
Give us a decent answer, Jacob.
It is a decent answer. It's not going to happen. I'm not really very posh. I'm out in the people.
And you enjoy what you do?
I love what I do. I'm very lucky to be able to do it.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I really
It's been great
appreciate
fun.
your time.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you.